I say what a lot of people say about 9/11. I remember, driving to work that day and saying what a beautiful day it was. The weather was absolutely gorgeous that day. But then, I was in my office working when a staff member came in and, said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And at that time, I think most people were speculating, oh, it had to be a small plane, because a commercial airliner would not be flying in that locale. But certainly, when the second plane hit the building, we certainly knew, that this was a terrorist attack. And I think the aviation industry as a whole responded very, very quickly. To this day, I give Jane Garvey, who was the head of the FAA at that time, a lot of credit for making the decision to immediately ground planes wherever they were. So you can imagine, that decision certainly resulted in a lot of ensuing chaos in terms of trying to get people back to different locations. But I think it was a very smart decision because at that time, we didn't really know what we were dealing with. On a city level, I remember having conversations with Chief Joe Kane. Joe was the fire chief at the time and was responsible for emergency management. So this fell right in his bailiwick to have to deal with from a citywide standpoint. Remember having conversations with Joe whether or not the city should be taking any actions to evacuate buildings at that time. But that shows you the level of knowledge we didn't have as to what we were dealing with in the immediate, minutes and hours after those first attacks of the World Trade Center.
How many flights roughly did you have moving around Manchester at that point? What did that grounding order mean for you?
Well, that was, would have been a fairly full day worth of activity. I think at that time we were probably handling probably somewhere between 3 to 4 million passengers at the airport. So there would have been an awful lot of activity occurring. So, once that order was given, there were no flights coming in and there were no flights leaving. Manchester, we did not receive any of the aircraft that were diverted that would typically be going to other airports. So we had what we had at the airport. And then I just remember, the terminal slowly emptying out, as people realized there was not going to be any further travel out of the airport. And then the question started to emerge, how does the system recover from something like this? And the FAA, who was in charge of airport security at that time, made a decision that every commercial service airport needed to be recertified to begin serving passengers again. And I'm pleased to say Manchester was one of the first airports in the country to get recertified to resume operations. And my recollection was that it was within a couple of days that we were able to restart the system at Manchester Airport.
What does that mean, recertification? What does the process look like?
Well, the FAA came in and wanted to review all of the security procedures that you had put in place, all of the protocols that you had in place moving forward to ensure that the airport, from a security standpoint, was ready to resume operations. So it's not a standard certification that you typically go through from a safety standpoint with the FAA. This was something that was set up right after 9/11 in terms of a series of different requests that the FAA had that you had to make sure and certify that you met. And to this day, I say I had one of the best teams ever at Manchester Airport, and really was a team effort to pull that together, because I think not only at the airport was there a desire to resume activity. We didn't want something like this, holding us, the country, back. But I think there was a community desire as well to see those flights resume. I think that was a signal, that people were looking for, that there was some level of normalcy that we were going to be able to return to.
So you have this great team. This unprecedented thing happens where all the flights are grounded and nobody knows what's going on. What do you say to your team? Just to get them through that morning, through that day?
Well, I think it was, the incident in itself, as everyone in the country experienced, was shocking in and of itself. How could something like this happen? So you're dealing with that emotion, but you were also dealing with the fact that, hey, we have to focus on the job at hand. Sooner or later, we're going to have to restore operations here at the airport. Yeah, there were a lot of question marks. How long were we going to be grounded? How quickly would the FAA allow us to resume activities? What would that activity be once we started to resume? Following 9/11, I remember an immediate drop of about 25% in terms of passenger activity. That was significant for us to try to get our arms around. Is that going to stay in place? Are people going to be reluctant to fly? And I think we did see, when people started to return to the airport, people would sit very tentatively in the hold room and kind of scan who's going to be on this plane with me. There was a lot of suspicion. So it took a lot for people to, feel confident again in terms of flying.
What were passengers like on that day?
Well, I think there was shock. I think people found it hard to believe that something like this could happen. I think there was confusion. Certainly people who were in the area from out of town are sitting there wondering, how am I going to get home? I remember there was a run on rental cars, and that I think occurred, throughout the country as people found themselves in a location to say, hey, that's the only alternative I have now is to drive to get home. But as I said, I do recall, the terminal emptying out rather quickly over time. And then you just had this eerie sense of, an airline terminal, airport terminal, completely empty other than employees.
I used the word unprecedented a minute ago, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. You've worked at a wide variety of airports. Had you ever seen anything like what happened that day in terms of flights just being grounded?
No, I mean, I had the unfortunate experience of working at airports where accidents have occurred and we've had to shut down the airport. But what the logical conclusion is to handling that accident and restoring operations. And usually that's done within a matter of hours or within a day. Here, it was unprecedented in that the system was shut down. I had never seen the entire system shut down like that. And I think we were all sitting there wondering, what's going to happen next? How long is the shutdown going to stay in place? So, yeah, I've been in the airport business now for about 46 years. Certainly, as I reflect on 9/11, I never experienced anything prior to 9/11 like that, and certainly haven't experienced really anything following that. Probably the closest, experience now is the pandemic that we just recently came through. And, quite frankly, the passenger drop following the pandemic was more severe than the passenger drop we experienced after 9/11. But the uncertainty around 9/11 and all of the emotional issues associated with 9/11, I've certainly never experienced anything like that before or since. But, folks have asked me, what was probably the biggest security improvement following 9/11? And it was a very simple improvement when you really think about it. But I think the hardening of the cockpit door within aircraft is probably the most fundamental but most important move that was made following 9/11. We've introduced naturally the TSA now, a professional security organization to standardize and federalize security across the country. So just the professionalism that the TSA brings was extremely important following 9/11. The improvements in equipment and screening equipment that have been introduced have been huge. At 9/11, we were actually trying to protect against a 1970s threat with 1970s equipment. Prior to 9/11, no one ever thought that someone would board an aircraft and purposely take the aircraft down and their own life along with it. That's not how threat assessments were being done at that time. Following 9/11, that completely changed. That mindset was completely different now. And, I do remember some challenges introducing new equipment, for example, full body scanners. A lot of people raising privacy concerns. But today, it's been widely accepted by the general public. And I think, everybody wants to be aboard their flight and feel safe. And I think, there's been a lot done in this industry to get people to that point. I mean, let's face it. I mean, local law enforcement, state law enforcement are very, very important in the context of airport security. But, having the TSA allow standardization across the country. And I think, every day, an organization like the TSA, as well as local law enforcement, is looking, ahead as to, well, what is the next threat that we have to guard against? So I do think there's a mindset that, security has to constantly evolve because the threats are constantly evolving. I think security's become a lot more proactive. I think, prior to 9/11, it was more a reaction to security issues. Keep in mind, prior to 9/11, security at airports was the responsibility of the airlines, and they typically carried that out through contract companies, right? So today, I think the professionalism that's been brought to this entire initiative across the country, I think people should feel very comfortable about what the aviation industry has done, and that as an industry, we continue to be very proactive in terms of looking forward to what are the future threats that we have to guard against to keep our passengers safe. My recollections of 9/11 were that it was a very good effort on the part of the city. I think the emergency management function of the city functioned very well that day. There was good communication. Certainly, with the airport being able to play the role of supplying information directly from air traffic control entities, because there was not a lot coming directly into the city. The only information that was being provided from the city was what we were getting through the FAA air traffic control system. So, that was a role that we were able to play that day in terms of providing information to the emergency managers in the city, who I think reacted very, very quickly and did a great job in terms of coordinating things. I give Chief Kane an awful lot of credit for what was on his shoulders that day, along with Mayor Baines. I think things worked very well in the city that day.